Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome and thank you very much for being with us today. I am Anne Michaud, Associate Dean for Pedagogy at HEC Paris, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome my colleague Jérémy Ghez, Associate Professor, for his talk titled Economic Decoupling and the Future of the European Ideal. So we are going to talk about economic decoupling, its drivers, and what it means for business and for the future of the European Union. Thank you very much, Jérémy, for accepting our invitation in the very special context of post-election in France. As a co-director of the Center of Geopolitics at HEC Paris, we are honored to have you today. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you on this historical day with a new president, or at least a president who's re-elected. We'll say a few words about what that means and how that relates to economic decoupling. Before we start, I'd love to know, who's online and where are you joining us from? You guys know how much I love the tool menti.com, so you can flash it, or you can go on menti.com and compose this code 45566298. And here's a little map of the world. Let's see you guys pin, where you're from and where are you watching from. As you guys do, say a few words about myself. I'm a professor of economics at HEC Paris. This theme of economic decoupling is an important one. It's a kind reminder of the fact that globalization might actually not be eternal, that there are plenty of pressures out there. And this election in France is actually a very cool case study, reminding all of us, where are we from and where we're going, what's the barometer of public opinion, feelings related to globalization. All of these questions are questions that we will tackle today. All right, I guess they're a little shy for now, but we have a few from Europe, even joining us from Asia. Awesome. All right, well, it's great to have you guys, and by all means, I hope you guys react throughout this webinar on Mentimeter. I'd love to know, where you guys stand. A few words about what happened yesterday over the past 2 weeks during this presidential election. As you know, Emmanuel Macron won. 58% is a sizable win. Historically speaking, it's among the best, not as good as what he did in 2007, obviously not as good as what Jacques Chirac did against Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen in 2002, but it's a sizable victory. It's also an important reminder that, when presented with two alternatives, key nation in France still favors the ability, of the political class to adapt to globalization, that option to adapt the country to globalization, rather than, this idea of protection. So we're still on this idea that dividends of globalization can still be reached at least. But 42% for Marine Le Pen is a sizable score. She's never scored this much. And whereas we used to be, from the landscape of French politics, more of a two-thirds, one-third, two-thirds against, two-thirds for trying to reap the benefits of globalization, and one-third trying to protect the country. By the way, exact same result we saw on LinkedIn on the LinkedIn poll. More than 600 people voted. Well, there you go. Now we're landing closer and closer and closer to a share of the population that is more like 50-50, 50% to adapt the country, 50% to protect the country against the changes of globalization. This is a kind reminder, I think, to Emmanuel Macron and to Western leaders across the world that the purpose of globalization still needs to be redemonstrated. That the purpose of globalization and the benefits of globalization probably still need to be reemphasized, redemonstrated, and this is going to be a key topic, I think, in the French elections and in Europe going down the line. The Economist says, this is a debate that matters beyond France. As you'll have understood, I can't agree more on that. It's a kind reminder, again, that, globalization, the way my generation experienced it between 1991 up until 2008, or even up until 2016, was something we thought would be taken for granted. Well, not so much anymore. There's still plenty of pressure to go through, and I think this is something we need to think about. What is also important is that this divide between those who defend globalization and who think that there's still benefits to be learned, and those who think it might actually be something more of a protection needed against globalization, is still very much alive. I'd love to know on your end that left and right divide probably is dead in France. Is it dead where you're standing from? I'd love to know. So again, menti.com. From your viewpoint, do you think that the left-right divide is still relevant? Is there still something to be said in that face-off, in that opposition? So I'll let you guys think about this for a second. And again, interestingly enough, you see this in many, many different countries. That traditional left-right is in question because those candidates who used to represent left and right, who used to be mainstream, aren't necessarily the ones we would expect. Now, increasingly, we're facing not so traditional candidates, not so mainstream candidates, and that left-right divide is probably not as significant as it used to be. What do you guys see on your end? Let's see. Well, you seem to disagree, huh? So quite split actually in there. So let's try to make sense out of this, and let's try to think about, what might that mean again? If this is not about the left-right divide, then potentially this might be about, again, a divide, those who argue in favor of protection versus those who argue in favor of adaptation. Again, right now, we're at 42-58 in France. We used to be, and on LinkedIn, it was 1/3, 2/3. So this is shrinking. This is shrinking. This has implications for the way we do business, and this might mean that the way we think about policy going down the line, the way we think about globalization going down the line may fundamentally shift, and this might actually be something to worry about, and this might actually be, again, this whole notion that economic decoupling is accelerating, that people don't necessarily believe in globalization per se, that people don't believe in the benefits it has to bring anymore, and this fundamentally puts into question that single, global, integrated, interdependent market that global businesses used to bet on. It sets the question of, to what extent will it actually be still there tomorrow, and to what extent does that actually require us to think about business practices going down the line. Let's go back to economic decoupling. And those of you who have been here, who were here exactly 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, on the very first webinar we gave on this topic, and then who have followed me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and with whom we've had a lot of discussions, and maybe who have read the HEC Paris AmCham report that was published in December 2021, kind reminder, all of these things really have mattered for quite some time, and we're accumulating a lot of evidence that this is not a theoretical risk, it's not an academic discussion, it's getting increasingly practical. So economic decoupling is about what? Well, when you have two nations, the US and China, obviously two of the two major economies there, who used to be very interdependent, who used to be very integrated, what happens the day they decide to divorce? What happens the moment that they decide that the benefits of that interdependence, the benefit of that global integration, are outweighed now by the political capital they may gain by divorcing? And in fact, when you think about it, and this is the point of the report that we wrote in December 2021, really three fundamental drivers to economic decoupling. Technology is certainly one, we'll get to it. Geopolitics is certainly a second. And as we're seeing increasingly, and yesterday was a kind reminder to all of us that politics as well is at play in driving economic decoupling. On the technology side, what we used to say, is that, this fourth industrial revolution would bring about simplification, would bring about more localization, and would bring about more digitalization of production processes. Well, all of this is actually panning out. It's actually being realized right in front of our very own eyes, and a kind of reminder that, all of this, again, not theoretical, not academic, basically materialized is not so controversial anymore. Now, the key idea for businesses around the world, in the West and in Europe and in France in particular, is about trying to redesign those factories, trying to harness automation, and trying to think about how do we basically try to leverage what the fourth industrial revolution has to mean. And it might actually mean reshoring or bringing some form of production processes back home. Now, this is not to mean it's reindustrialization. It's not about bringing jobs back home the way Donald Trump would have argued, but it's about trying to redesign those factories. Kousmiti is, I think, one interesting example of all of this, reminding us of how, through automation, through new technologies, there are completely new factories that make Made in France actually possible again. This is all thanks to technology. Yesterday was about very long supply chains extended worldwide, trying to leverage every single comparative advantage that you could find no matter where it was in the globe. And now it's about redesigning those factories in a way that makes sense, in a way that leverages automation, in a way that leverages technology. You don't need those supply chains, those super extended supply chains anymore the way they used to be. All right, 3 drivers. Technology, we said. Let's go to geopolitics. Geopolitics is interesting, because, again, it was all about this idea that, the United States and China, if they ever decided to divorce, well, globalization would actually fragment. Especially supply chains would not be as extended as they were in the past. Norms and standards would be quite different. That was what we used to think academically from that scenario standpoint. Well, what's happening right now? This war in Ukraine has certainly shown the extent to which this was not a hypothetical scenario. It was a true scenario. Globalization means what? It means that Western leaders have still the ability to sanction Russia, to act on issues related, say, to SWIFT, as much has been said about, to freeze the Russian central bank's financial assets. So it still means that. But it also means at the very same time that you have to recognize that globalization might mean you need to shield yourself. China is watching very closely. As we all know, China also has territorial claims on the island of Taiwan. And this means that if China ever decided to reclaim that victory, or that land rather, through a military victory, well, it would need to shield itself against Western sanctions. It's developing its own a system that is a rival to SWIFT. It is trying to digitalize its currency in order to avoid seeing those reserves being frozen going down the line. So interestingly, globalization means you can sanction, but it also means that true big European powers, big global powers like China are also trying to shield themselves. This too today is actually accelerating economic decoupling. As a result of this, you see supply chains and costs being affected as a result. This was quoted by a French news station, BFM TV, a study by Émile Frey France, who found that the cost of new cars is up by 15% over the past 3 years. To give you a specific idea, the Tesla Model 3 is up by 6,000 euros in January. I say this because I think we have plenty of examples all over the place, all over the globe, of these types of disruptions. When China and the United States decide to divorce, when you have plenty of pressures exerted on globalization, you clearly see the effects on supply chains, and this has very concrete effects ultimately on prices. This is something that businesses are going to have to account for going down the line. And last but not least, a third driver is the politics part in all of this. We used to think, and I think this is largely true, you could score political mileage by blaming globalization or some form of it, and promising to bring jobs back home and punish countries who you think abuse the system. Well, today, it goes even further than this. And there is a pervasive sense that, the middle classes need to be protected because they have been the real losers of globalization. Even though globalization may offer benefits for a wide range of populations, when they react, and they react violently from time to time in the poll stations, you really have to basically think about what their interests are and how do you protect those vulnerable families. Yesterday, it used to be about global interdependence, about global integration, and this explains why today a lot of the discourse you hear is about sovereignty, about self-reliance, about autonomy that are far more fashionable. And those who know me know that I always go back to the same example when it comes to the middle classes. You know, this whole idea, everyone remembers Homer Simpson. He was this best example of representing the global middle class in the United States, but even beyond. And a lot of people are starting to say, you know, interestingly enough, Homer Simpson, well, he had 3 children. He had an old father. He had a house, he had 2 cars, he had a job, and he had a well-paying job, a highly skilled job in a nuclear factory. He went obviously all over the world and had all of those adventures that entertained us for so long. What is incredibly interesting is that he used to represent what the middle class stood for, and what is interesting now is that more and more people are saying, but that's the rich person's life, it's not the middle class anymore. This is a broken promise that I think politics are trying to fix, and when they're trying to fix it, well, they have to revert back to the idea of sovereignty, of self-reliance, of autonomy, because this brings a lot more political mileage, and I think this is an additional piece of pressure exerted on globalization ultimately. So there you have it, 3 fundamental drivers of economic decoupling at work. We saw yesterday what we thought. We saw that we're acquiring a lot of confirmation, a lot of evidence on all of this, and I think it's a kind reminder to all of us that economic decoupling, globalization fragmenting is actually not a test. Something, again, we documented in this white book in 2021, December 2021, fast changing, the war in Ukraine, and further evidence, I think, from a wide range of electorates throughout the world, kind of reminder that this pressure is still very much real, and that this goes beyond a divorce between economic, between China and in the United States. It has far broader ramifications when you think about it. So economic decoupling is still at play and is becoming a far more global phenomenon. Where do we go, and what does this mean when it comes to implications for business and for the European Union and beyond? Yesterday, we used to have French solutions that we thought, again, academically interesting, theoretically interesting, but they were at the fringe, they were marginal. Now, more and more, they're becoming clearly favorites and far more mainstream at a rate that I would have, to be honest, never really imagined in the past. Number 1, this idea of going local. And again, going local is an interesting thing because it means that, you know, yesterday's supply chains, overextended supply chains, to try to basically reduce costs, to try to diversify risk, to try to go seek that comparative advantage no matter where it was around the globe. Well, all of this is getting far more obsolete than what we thought. The pandemic was a revealer of all of this. The war in Ukraine is a revealer, but this is a long-term structural trend. Going local is not as obsolete as it used to be, and it's not as crazy and as a fringe idea as it used to be, especially, again, thanks to automation, thanks to new factories around the globe. This might actually be the new normal ultimately. Obviously, think of 3D printing, think of all of those technologies leading to more simplification, leading to more digitalization, and again, leading to more localization as a result. Again, circular economy, fringe idea 2 years ago. It used to be those ideas that we used to think about in the classroom without any necessary view of the long-term ramifications this used to have. Now, more and more big businesses are realizing how significant these ideas are. It's an idea that's becoming increasingly mainstream. And a highly ranked partner in a consulting firm once told me what he's seeing even is that, some major companies out there who are big and who understand, they don't understand social entrepreneurs. They don't understand how to implement what social entrepreneurs are doing. They're getting closer to social entrepreneurs for that agility, for that nimbleness that they're trying to basically leverage ultimately. And that too is something incredibly important. I used to make a whole session on my class on shared value. It used to create interest, it used to create and spark a lot of debates internally, but again, it was an internal debate. More and more and more people are starting to realize that the fate of business is really interrelated to the fate of their local environment. And the more they invest in their local environment, less for reputation issues, less for reasons related to greenwashing and all of that, and more because they depend on a healthy labor market. They depend on a healthy and well-educated labor force. The more they understand that, the better they do. Shared value, again, this is actually 2011, right in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Well, 10 years later, again, this sounds like an incredibly far more mainstream idea than it used to be. So solutions from the past, that used to be marginal, but now, well, they're from the past, but they're so well accepted, so well ingrained in people's thinking that now they're actually quite mainstream. But then there's this new thing. It appears, I think this is a key idea going and circling back to what happened in France yesterday and what will happen in other European and Western capitals going down the line. This pervasive sense, that politics must probably prevail. This means that politicians are probably thinking that globalization, we used to hope for the dividends. We used to have a key hope that the dividends would basically trickle down. More and more politicians are thinking, we don't have that time anymore. We don't have that time. We're in a sense of urgency. And when people revolt, probably for legitimate reasons, then we have a problem that we have to weigh on immediately. So that sense that politicians, that politics must have a say in globalization, again, that's going to be a driver, a key spark. Right now, the people and the group of thought, the school of thought that believes that we still have a say in globalization, that we can still adapt the country to globalization, and that we can still reap the benefits. This is still about 60% of an electorate in a key country like France in the broader European construction. Probably the same in Germany, probably the same in the United States. Until what time? Until what point? And if politicians take legitimate action to act, and again, all of this is very legitimate, this might actually be a force weighing in on globalization, and meaning that all of those companies that depended and that hoped for that one single global market, well, it might not be there going down the line, and that might be something that we need to think about. So we asked the key question of how do Europeans respond ultimately, and again, I'd love to hear from you guys. Over the past 15 years, do you think that there has been a fragmentation of globalization? Do you think that there have been growing pressure on this? Do you think that this has been something that has been growing over the past 15 years? I'd love to hear where you guys think and where you guys stand, whether this has grown, remained about the same, or lessened over time. Love to hear from this. As you guys vote, please remember that this is an ongoing debate. It really relates a lot to the type of conversations we continuously have. The opportunity of the French elections gave us the opportunity of this webinar, but I hope you stay in touch via LinkedIn, via Twitter, via all of that social media, because I think this is a conversation we need to have, and there's still plenty of open questions about business practices going down the line. Let me actually show results. Aha, well, there's kind of a great consensus around this, huh? In your view, actually, before we move on to this, one last point. Interestingly enough, the guy who just won presidency yesterday, who probably has the momentum on his side, who probably is and has, not probably, has the European presidency guaranteed until June, probably already answered this whole debate about pressure on globalization. Remember, this is 2019. This is a much talked about interview with The Economist, in which he basically says, NATO, well, is brain dead. And it's an interesting image that he has. It's this basic notion of saying, NATO still functions, but this whole idea of the West doesn't work anymore. The body is still able, but the head isn't working. It doesn't have a vision. And what he states, this is 2019, bear that in mind, before the pandemic and before, obviously, the war in Ukraine. What he has in mind is basically to say, okay, well, we need to basically promote strategic autonomy, and without strategic autonomy, well, we're dead. So strategic autonomy means what? A lot has been said, a lot has been written about the military realm of this, the military chapter of all of this, but when you listen to Emmanuel Macron, it goes well beyond military, it goes well beyond the question related to NATO. It's actually related to energy, it's actually related to industrialization, it's actually related to all of those questions that make Europe potentially strong. And what he says is that, yes, of course, there might actually be effects on costs. Yes, this might actually play and be more pricey to actually implement this. And note the irony of the president saying this of the Yellow Vest movement, the country of the Yellow Vest movement. This is no small feat on his part, but it's certainly saying, you know, Europe has to play a role. Europe has to play a role by trying to be less dependent on the United States, less dependent on China, and trying to promote an image of Europe as probably the third player in this showdown between the United States and China, and probably being able to promote an alternative message. Interestingly enough, he says this is not about the economics anymore of the problem, it's more about the politics. It's not enough anymore to say that Europe is about a common market. Europe has to go beyond that, and it has to be the politics. Let's see and again, accepting higher costs. He stated that March 2nd, that's a very interesting transcript you may want to read, addressed to the nation about Ukraine. He says, it comes at a cost, but that's the very cost of our freedom and liberty as Europeans to try to promote all of this. Again, well, trying to find an alternative route and to defend that European ideal. That's his answer. His ability to build a coalition around that idea going down the line. His ability to reunite European partners around that ideal is probably going to be the key issue and the key open question in coming months after that momentum that he may have won last night. So, again, economic decoupling certainly still at play. Europe wants to be that actor, and it may not be an actor of integration or an actor of interdependence worldwide. So this too might actually be an additional driver of economic decoupling with all of what actually means ultimately. I'd love to hear from you guys. So your view about the nature of the European construction. Do you think this is more about economics, or do you think this has been more about politics with regional powers coexisting? That European project in your mind, again, more about that single integrated market or more about politics? Let's see where we stand on this. Excuse me. Yeah, 71-29. So up until now, it's been a lot about economics. All right. How about in the future? Same question. What do you anticipate? Do you anticipate that change? Do you think it will be more about politics going down the line? Or do you think it still will be about economics ultimately? I'd love to hear what you think again. I'll let you guys vote. In the future, wow, see, that shift is actually happening increasingly about politics, exactly the way we're going after going down the line. Thanks a lot for voting. All right, well, when I wrote this book in 2019, there was no pandemic. There was no war in Ukraine, driven by Russia. There was actually none of that. And my point was to say, a tsunami is coming, and I didn't expect any of this, but what I did expect was to say deep transformation and a globalized system that was ripe for disruption. That there was plenty of anger to go for it, and that a lot of people were basically aiming for deep fundamental change. We've had, in the past 2 to 3 years, a real illustration of what that actually means, a real illustration of people basically testing the system and not taking for granted what my generation took for granted when it comes to globalization and when it comes to the benefits of globalization going down the line. What is interesting about this whole debate is, again, architects of change. What does that mean? It means that there's still a lot of models to reinvent. There's still a lot of ideas to basically put together. And I think that big macro debate about big macro forces that feel incredibly impressive and humbling to a lot of us. But let's remember that we too have a say in this debate. So I certainly hope that we continue to keep in touch and that we continue to have this conversation all together. And in the meantime, well, I'm happy to take all of your questions and to discuss this with you. Thanks a lot for following, and
thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much to our audience. Jeremy, we of course, you can imagine that we'll have many questions. Before that, so we've been talking about economic decoupling. Actually, strategic autonomy is very ambitious. Do you think, I know you've given some examples already, do you think France today has the means to do it?
Yeah, and it's important to think about that. Macron is in a very strange position in which, it seems that a lot of European capitals are very happy with the outcome of this election. This gives him momentum. It gives him momentum because he's been in power for 5 years, contrary to his counterpart in Berlin, who just got elected after a very messy election. So it gives them a sense of seniority. And I think that a lot of capitals also look at this president in a very, very odd way, wondering, who is this guy who is neither left nor right, came out of nowhere 5 years ago. So he has that momentum. But it's not entirely clear, and I think this is absolutely true, that in Eastern Europe, in countries that feel incredibly threatened by Russia, in countries that believe they depend a lot on the United States, that this idea is gaining traction. So I think he's going to have to spend a lot of political capital. I think he has the means. To answer the question, I think he has the means, but it's certainly a very ambitious one and an incredibly political, audacious move to convince a lot of people out there.
So do you think advantage or disadvantage actually to
go
for it?
It's going to come at a cost. And interestingly enough, again, that March 2nd speech he gives to the nation, in which he doesn't really talk about strategic autonomy, but he talks about it implicitly. He says all of this comes at a price, but it's at a price of our liberty, of our freedom. So in the short run, it certainly comes at a cost. There's a transition. In the longer run, it may mean that Europe gets a little bit more leverage back, that it's not in a position where it needs to choose between China and the United States, and that it basically sees the world in a place where it gets to make the rules up. And I think this is going to be important for the European Union to play that role going down the line.
Certainly. And just to close maybe on this topic, what do you think would be the consequences of going for this strategy?
Socially, it's going to cost. Again, this is happening in the country of the yellow vests. And let's remember how this whole movement started. A lot of people remember that tax on gas prices, which is correct, but there's even an ancestor in terms of the disagreement. It's when the French government decided to limit the speed of cars on rural roads. And that too, symbolically, about move on mobility, on the ability to move around, symbolically that meant something. So socially, this president is going to have to pay attention to this. There are plenty of parts, areas of France, of Europe that feel incredibly constrained, that feel incredibly isolated from the rest of globalization, and that he's going to have to integrate it. In his speech last night, he says he's fully conscious of his opponent's score, and that this is going to have to make him make some commitments. So socially speaking, how do you basically act? I'm old enough to remember President Macron of 5 years back when he said, I can't protect your job, and I can't promise to protect your job. That would be a lie. It would be going against globalization, against automation. But I can make sure I can promise to protect you and protect your children. As you know, maybe some parents are listening, they know how important that might actually be. Protecting you means investing in training, giving you all the skills you need to fight in this globalized landscape. And really being able to say, we're going to have to transform this labor force, but the state is here to help you out. That's the form of protection that I think is compatible with globalization. Does he have the political means to put that forward? That too, I think, is a key question. I certainly will be on the lookout for that.
And also probably the ability to continue doing that while potentially going for some more autonomy, as you mentioned.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
So that is
a complex fight ahead.
The timing. Okay, so I'm now looking at, I'm sorry, I'm going to read at the same time because I discover questions with you. There is a question from Amin from LinkedIn saying, what do you think about COP21 and the engagement of the European Union, US, Russia, China? What is the impact relating, and if Emmanuel Macron can change anything now after the French election that happened yesterday? Well,
that's a terrific question, Amina, on many fronts. What do I think of COP21? Underwhelming and disappointing. It seems like a really big mass, where people try to limit how bad they feel about their inaction. And what's interesting is that most of the commitments that came are probably non-binding. But businesses are playing a larger role in these conversations. That's one big thing. And second thing, to think a little bit more cynically, if you forgive me, from a political standpoint, I think that what Emmanuel Macron is probably missing politically to build a coalition in parliament is probably a more progressive tone. The Socialist Party is not doing very well. I don't think there's any possibility of compatibility between Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-left candidate in France, who scored incredibly well in France, and Emmanuel Macron. I don't think there's probably any compatibility there. Perhaps he looks at the Green Movement. And the Green Movement has been very vocal about the type of things that France needs to do. This might actually be an interesting match between the most pragmatic elements of the Green Movement, willing to talk to Macron in exchange for a set of key compromises and key ideas. So this is where he goes next. Think about the ramifications this might have for nuclear energy in Europe and in France in particular. We know the French Green Movement is not a lot in favor of that, but think as well about all the possibilities this might have to finally put climate on the French president's agenda, and it hasn't been the case so far.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jeremy. We have probably a comment as well, more than a question, but from LinkedIn, and Xavier, who says, well, but Europe has been primarily built for peace. And the situation that we have now today obviously is a new one. So how might this change the way we think about Europe in Europe?
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful comment too, and I think he's absolutely right. Especially, this used to be the stuff we learned, especially as Europeans, that the stuff we were supposed to learn in history books, but it's happening on our very eyes. Let me try to venture this comment as a response, which is, there has been a lot said about the ability to think about Europe as this club, attractive club that people still want to join, that basically people still have value because it's a 500 million plus market with that set of protection, that set of leadership. And I think that the ability of Europe to continue to shine as that club might actually be the best type of pressure we exert on other nations, including a future Russia. Where you're absolutely right and where we can't be too idealistic is that we used to think that globalization was about, interdependence. We remember, a lot of people saying there's no way Putin would go to war. It's not in his interest. Well, we now start to realize we had a very poor understanding or a very narrow understanding, which says the same thing about his intentions. So I think you're absolutely right. Europe was built for peace, but it also has an asset in terms of attracting new people and attracting new nations as well as that model that it seeks to become. So, time will tell, but that might be the offensive tool that Europe might actually be able to leverage.
Thank you. So there's a question that comes back quite often, and I think it's especially for the French context, is very important. We have a question that was phrased by Jorge on LinkedIn, who says, do you think the HEC 40 is ready to integrate this political shift? And or is it not the case? What's your opinion about it? And overall, do you think it will be welcomed positively or negatively by those companies?
Is that a question on climate change, or is that a question on the election outcomes?
I think it's a question of what about the economic decoupling?
Of economic decoupling.
I think it was.
No, absolutely. Two things. We know that stock markets are incredibly short-sighted. So this is not the type of threat that they probably implement overnight, and they probably integrate overnight. This being said, the pressures on globalization, you guys basically showed this and agreed with this, they've been long-lasting. In addition, that tension between China and the United States has been long-lasting. The risk of seeing a far-right movement access presidency or leadership in Europe has been long-lasting. And I tend to think that for all I know, the financial markets, hedge funds have already embedded that risk in the way they price. I don't think they've embedded the climate change risk necessarily, because that would really be the game-changing and catastrophic risk. But I think that they probably integrated that risk and might be betting on the ability of businesses to reinvent and to rethink basically their production processes, technology helping. So that might be one of the game to play going down the line, but I think that's an important comment in terms of trying to make sure that the finance community has its eye on the ball, certainly.
Thank you. So I have many questions. I'm sorry, maybe I won't be able to, we won't be able to address all of them. There was one maybe also linked to economic decoupling, asking if the one of Russia could destabilize European Union.
Oh, most certainly. It already has, from the standpoint of, there would be no war because economic interdependence was so great. Well, that was an assumption that was blown away by this war, and I think it's a reminder for all of us to be careful with these types of assumptions. We tend to think, that dictators, that authoritarian regimes respond to the same incentives we have. Well, it seems, or it proves that their tolerance for risk is way higher, and that their definition of interest is actually far more narrower than far broader, than our own narrow definition, and that it's not just economic. It's about survival. It's about their own legacy going down the line. So we've been destabilized already. But on the other side, we've been organizing ourselves. I am surprised by how much unity there is inside the West over all of this. That might have actually been one of Putin's miscalculations. I am also surprised by how well we've actually basically been able to stick together when it came to sanctions. This doesn't mean that there won't be divisions going down the line. It doesn't mean that there won't be any questions asked when it comes to our ability to function. And even more to the point, I think that we have to remember the West is incredibly united, but it's all alone. And when we talk to our friends from African countries or from Latin American countries, they often sense a dose of hypocrisy that they find quite disturbing on our end, because we're talking about Ukrainians and not a war in an African country or a war elsewhere that might have been bloodier and even more cruel. So we've been destabilized, and our reaction has been called hypercritical, and for all I know, quite legitimately. We can talk about that. But on the other side, we've still stuck together. Again, a matter of balance. The balance is precarious. For now, we're sticking. Time will tell where this war goes ultimately.
Right. So I'm sorry, questions are a little bit, as they come. In fact, we've talked about the impact on the financial markets and their readiness to accept all this. There was another question from LinkedIn as well, saying, well, globalization has mostly been about getting lower prices, sometimes higher quality as well. The point is, are customers ready to accept what would be the consequences of what one of our attendees also called maybe globalization?
No, I think that's absolutely it. Consumers are, well, that green consumer isn't there just yet. That green consumer hasn't appeared in the data. The new generation might bring it about, It might be a forced change as well, because getting cheap goods across the world might not be doable. If anything, if there's an agreement on the price of carbon, for instance, those prices might actually go through the roof quite quickly. So there's the real question of, okay, the consumer, what are we ready to accept in the name of politics and geopolitics? Quite a few of us have always thought to ourselves, we're ready to pay more if we know we're buying local, but does that stand in time? Does that stand in economic crisis? I think that's a really wonderful question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is this is a key indicator to be correct, and I ultimately wondered, will we have a choice? The evidence that is accumulating certainly shows this movement is structural and is happening. Will we have a choice? And what does that mean for the politicians sitting in the pilot seat in terms of educating or in terms of bringing the consumers to better understand these things? That is going to be a key to success and to political stability, I think.
Thank you, Jeremy. You also have questions about the energy, because it's been one of the topics lately. So we have a question from Yizu on LinkedIn saying European energy industry uniformation is essential to keep Europe in the playground. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And where do you get that energy from, ultimately, you know? The French probably have an answer, which is nuclear energy. It's not entirely clear that this is consensual in France, and it's certainly clear that it is not consensual in Europe. On the other hand, Europe has been very vocal, to go back to the different COPs, right? In the COP21, very vocal about climate change, very vocal about respecting our commitments. Without nuclear energy, it seems somewhat hard, especially as we're starting to talk about a ban on Russian oil and perhaps even Russian gas. Where do we look to? Well, we might need to look to the United States, talk about strategic autonomy, maybe not the best move in the world. I think ultimately there's going to have to be a debate over the nuclear part, a question as well about the ability to accelerate that ecological transition when it comes to new sources of energy as well. All of these, interestingly enough, are far less technical in nature than political in nature. And this is where I think all of us probably have a bigger say than what we think.
Great. Maybe a last one.
Of course.
Because I know time is running as well. How environmental geopolitics expand our understanding of risk and security? Yeah.
What's interesting is that up until now, globalization has been a real economic movement. Just like the European construction, exactly the way you guys saw it from a data standpoint, right? In the polls. It's been a lot about that single market, about that economic market, integration of basically the different markets, interdependence, and so on. It's been a lot about economics. Increasingly, what we see is that a lot more politics have been involved in this because there's the pressure from the voters, because there's the pressure from that ecological transition, and because there's pressure as well in terms of political stability. How do we make sure that overall all of this is maintained in spite of the fact that trickle-down economics isn't working or isn't working fast enough? So I think geopolitics and politics are going to matter far more in this new phase of globalization. Two movements, the ones who think countries can adapt, the ones who think that countries need to protect. If the first one prevails, then you can expect economics to still play a significant role and to keep geopolitics in check. If the second one grows as it has been growing over time, then you can certainly expect politics to play a far bigger role and economics to be in the second, or at least not in the pilot seat as it has been in the past.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
For this talk after this French election. It was very interesting to look at it in the bigger picture of Europe and world decoupling, economic decoupling. Thank you very much for everybody who was online today, and please stay tuned for our forthcoming webinars. Thank you very much. Bye.
Take care.